This Final Cut Pro 10 Tour presentation is brought to you by the LumaForge Share Station, the world's best storage for Final Cut 10. For more information on how the Share Station can improve your workflow, head on over to lumaforge.com.
For the best part of a century, they have lived quietly amongst us.
I was born in 1932.
Germany, in Berlin.
Brussels, in Belgium, February 1940.
Men and women sharing their powers.
Maybe that's the reason why I stayed alive, to tell the story.
The power to move.
It was such a powerful thing to hear.
Inspire.
If people come up to me and want to shake my hand.
Quite often they want to hug me.
Guide. And teach.
Don't discriminate against other people.
Think for yourself. Don't listen to propaganda.
The power to open eyes. Transform lives. Change their future.
Spark their imagination.
The power to build a better, kinder, safer world.
If you see anything being done which is wrong, like bullying, speak up.
Ordinary men and women with extraordinary strengths. If only they also had the power of immortality.
We soon won't be here anymore.
I do find the energy draining from me.
Now, through the power of 3D technology, we can all keep their stories alive.
Keep our words alive.
And try to make the world a little bit better.
Because these are the men and women who know the truth about mankind.
Once you dehumanize a group of people,
Even animals are kinder to each other.
I can never imagine myself scared for my life.
A truth that needs to live forever.
People come out touched and moved by the experience.
hopefully it will leave a legacy.
It's quite an incredible project.
Truth forever. Truth forever. Forever.
So yeah, I'm Tom from Pollen Studio in York, and I'm here to talk to you about a really intensive raw workflow with Final Cut Pro 10 that we have been on for sort of the last 2 years. And it's a project called the Forever Project. I'll try and give you some background of the project. There are hundreds of survivors of the Holocaust left in the United Kingdom, each of which, some of them give personal talks around the United Kingdom, but most of those take place at the Holocaust Centre, which is located near Nottingham, and they take place in the Grand Hall that they have there. All of the talks are unique, and they're very beautiful. They're something that is, captivating, and something more importantly that people can learn from and that future generations can learn from. As people are quite elderly that experience the Holocaust, in 20 or 30 years' time, it's highly likely that those talks won't be available. So the National Holocaust Centre outlined a simple need, and that was to try and make sure that this experience wasn't lost. So the concept was created by Bright White, and that is to create a virtual survivor. A virtual survivor was going to be, and is, a 3D projection in the Grand Hall at the Holocaust Centre, where after listening to the survivor talk, somebody can be given a microphone, rather like today in a plenary session, and they can ask the 3D projection questions, which it responds in real time. So there was a lot of software programming to go with it, but what also was involved was an enormous amount of production. So an agency called Bright White that we've worked with for many years, they're fantastically creative. They came up with the concept for this. And we were appointed by Bright White initially for a technical consult to see whether it was possible and feasible. And then once the project was given the green light, we were appointed for stereo filming and stereo post-production, audio post-production, and delivery of all of the finished files. And then we also gave them location services, so most of the filming took place at our studio near York. We ran through the workflow in 1080p and with broadcast standard 1080p cameras with a fixed lens. And we sort of found that that was possible, and we looked at it by using Premiere, and we saw that it was possible to export each file, but it was going to take a long time, and we said to Bright White, yes, we can do it. We then started testing in 4K with the Red Scarlet first. And that was based on the fact that there was a new projector release that was capable of doing 4K at 60p with dual pipe input, so it meant that we could actually deliver full 4K 3D. So once we'd got the confidence that we could go with 4K, we looked to Red after an extensive testing period, and 10 survivors who were sort of very experienced at giving their talk were chosen, and Bright White worked with them for quite a long period of time to try and prepare them and sort of get to know them for what was likely to be a very sort of intensive and difficult filming process. Eventually we invested in 2 Red Epic Dragons for the project. We found that they had sort of unparalleled quality for the resolution we were filming at. They were very flexible, the form factor was great, so that we could put them on an over or under rig, we could put them on a side-by-side rig, and we didn't shoot at 6K, we shot at 4K, and the result of that, the reason for that was because when we costed through the project, we also thought about everything from storage and at all sort of angles we could, and we realised that the 6K storage was going to be enormous. So we went down the 4K route, but we still got the value of the 6K sensor, and the Dragon's sensor is fantastic. So each survivor was filmed for a full week, and we delivered a minimum of 30 hours of rushes. That meant that because we were filming in dual stereo, that was 60 hours of R3D, and it was 30 hours of ProRes, which with external audio tracks, which there was 3 separate external audio tracks, that meant we had 90 hours of audio, and we also had 1 link to each camera. So when we started to take on the filming process, it became quickly apparent of how important it was, and also how pressurized the situation was for filming, because the project was not able to afford any mistakes. The survivors were elderly, and it wasn't likely that they would be able to revisit and re-endure the filming process, so we had to make sure that we got it right the first time round. We had to be very, very careful with the rushes, so we went through I'll get to it, but the post-production process actually started during filming. So what we did was we used Shotput Pro to get the rushes off. They all went onto G-Tech Studio XL drives at RAID 10 for security, and then it was duplicated again with Shotput Pro to RAID 5. Audio, we started mastering immediately whilst we were recording. That was done separately by a separate technician. So an average of 1,000 questions were asked to each survivor. So when you factor in that we had a left and a right file to deliver and a side camera to be delivered, that meant that each survivor needed over 3,000 files to be delivered for their filming week, which were then relinked through unique file names so that they could be projected with FrameSync. Hugely intensive. We linked all of the files to the external audio, which was mastered. That was mastered in Audition, and all of the 4K video needed stereo aligning. I'll try and get to that bit, which was not easy. And like I've already said, each needed naming to a specific convention so that it could be called up by the software that was being written. Before we started, and throughout the first filming period, we tested and we actually started doing the post-production process with Premiere. It worked nicely when we could import data, and we could start with the import of data. The performance was good for playback, but what we couldn't do was automate everything. And as we started to ask more and more questions, we realized that the project was not going to be possible without being able to automate exports, because Premiere couldn't actually automate anything for us without dynamic link. And if you've used dynamic link, it's very, very easy to crash dynamic link, which we found to our horror. So we went down that road, and Premiere wasn't going to be right for us. We looked at Resolve, and the early versions of Resolve were great for stereo. It's fantastic for doing stereo alignment. It was really good for obviously for grading tools, but it was very, very time consuming for the editing. We needed to use compound clips. Each clip needed linking to the external audio with a compound clip, and when we eventually exported it, we found a few audio glitches. So I got in touch with Ronnie, and Ronnie recommended FCPX. He recommended that we talk to Sam Mestman, and Sam gave us the great idea of working with FCPX and looking at the stereo workflow as a multicam file. Due to the storage space that we'd actually budgeted for and the project had, and obviously as any project does, we couldn't work with proxy workflows, because it meant that if we filmed 3 survivors over a 3-week period, we generated over 20 terabytes of data. So then when we looked at producing proxies, there wasn't enough storage space for us to do that securely at RAID 10 and then at RAID 5 and start editing. So it meant that we had to use a RAW workflow, and we needed a piece of software that was going to be fast and efficient with RAW. So we had to work with the RAW for import, we had to work with the RAW for editing and for stereo alignment. We had to do the audio linking, metadata tagging, and all of the projects then needed exporting to individual files. And the beauty of FCPX was that as we started using it, we found that there was a fantastic network of support, but also there was some really great plugins being built that we could actually buy and use with the project, which became an integral part of it. So typically the workflow went that an edit assistant, whilst we were filming, would import from one of the RAID drives, the RAID 5 for performance. They would import all of the footage for the day, and they would, well, not for the day actually, it started even quicker than that. After almost each session or lunch session, they would import the footage. If anybody's ever worked with 3D, especially on separate cameras, the most important thing is having proper frame sync, because it becomes not very uncomfortable, but actually for people who have any conditions like epilepsy, it can become unhealthy for them to sit and watch not true frame synced video. So it should be noted that even though we worked this into our workflow, the RED actually we didn't drop sync once through the entire filming process of like a year and a half, so they worked fantastically well, but we still needed to do that. So they would check sync, and then they would actually start looking at the alignment of each file, and I'll talk about that why in a minute. And they would add some metadata tags. They'd organise the footage into sort of sessions and days, and then they would use the multicam tool to sync it, and that's where FCPX started to shine. Because when we imported the files, we were importing sort of 40-minute to an hour files in one go, and FCPX was so quick that what we could do was start looking at those files in the preview window, and we could drop a marker as exactly the point, or almost exactly the point that the clapper board synced, and then we could use the multicam tool to sync by the marker, sorry, and that happened in seconds, so that we were immediately able to then start looking at the multicam sync. What that meant was that when we looked at it, we wanted to make sure that we had motion blur at the right point for when the clapperboard was coming down, and we got that immediately. And because that became such a fast part of our workflow, it started during the shooting process, so that we could immediately say, after the DIT had been done and we could verify that we'd got the files copied off, we could say those cards can be blanked, we can start again with them, because we know that we've got frame sync, and it's true frame sync on the footage that's been shot. Once they'd then actually synced in multicam, we started looking at stereo alignment. And we did initially look at using Dashwood's 3D, the brilliant tool that there is. But what we found was that because we worked with RAW, processing became a real issue. It slowed the system down. And if anybody's ever worked with 3D, once you've got experience at it, you know exactly what to look for. So you know where you're looking for any errors. The issue that we had with alignment wasn't just 3D, because we worked in a totally non-linear way. Because if you think about how the nature of how somebody might ask a question, so that the survivor could respond, or the virtual survivor could respond in the right way, it meant that a question asked on a Monday could be then followed by a question asked on a Thursday. So we had to then blend those images together in a way that we didn't lose any sort of alignment sync. So everything needed aligning in 2D and then 3D, and that's how we did it. So we knew that by looking at the image here, you can see that we've got the convergence has been set at the point where the back of the chair is, because that was usually the point at which the survivor's eyes would be, and then everything from that came out of the screen. The right camera was laid over the top of the left camera, dropped to 50% opacity, and then we could actually start moving it around to make sure that we'd got the right alignment. So we could judge whether we'd got left and right movement, we could judge whether we'd got rotation, and from that we were able to put a really, really accurate 3D alignment, and we tested this with projection and then on 3D monitor to make sure it was working right. I should also say that this was playing back in real time with 2 4K raw clips. One of them, the right camera, did have an effect dropped onto it, which was the flip effect, because when you film through a mirror rig, you end up with one of the images inverse, so you just need to flip it. So it did have a basic effect dropped on it, but the fact that we could play that back, 2 4K raw clips at the same time on the same timeline, was pretty amazing. We then got to the editing stage, and because we were working with multicam, we knew that it was everything that happened after the multicam was we didn't have to add any other effects. So the multicam sequence was dropped into a new project. The project was edited, and then once we'd finished that project, it was then duplicated twice, and we switched the angles for the entire sequence so that it would be a left, a right, or a Blackmagic file, and then they were all synced to the mastered audio, which at times, because the edit started before some of the audio was actually delivered, was imported at a later date, but because we knew we had sync, it was just a file name update when we relinked the media, which was fantastic. So after this came the export process, which was one of the most crucial parts of the project, because it could be automated. And this was the beauty of FCPX and its environment, was that we could work alongside somebody who'd manufactured a plugin, and it was perfect for us. And the plugin that we use is Primaries. If anybody's used Primaries exporters, it was just perfect. So Thomas Chabot was so helpful to us. He answered phone calls, he debugged, he sent us updated versions. Again, one of the perfect things of the atmosphere of FCPX. What this meant was that entire sequence in RAW, Primaries boots it out as whatever codec you want, it will spit it out at. So we wanted ProRes as a delivery file, so it spat the whole thing out as one big ProRes file, and then it cuts it all up into individual files for us. So that was perfect, because we knew that we had frame synced media that was then individual files that were at the same point, so we had a left and a right and a Blackmagic. So each project was used by Primaries exporter 3 times, and it was automated. So it meant that we didn't have an intensive export process. So this could work perfectly for someone in a heavy VFX department where they need to spit from RAW down to another proxy footage so that somebody can do VFX on it, and then it can be relinked at a later date. So Primaries was fantastic for us. What it also did, and this was really cool, because what it did was it exports an XML of your entire project, and inside, and also an Excel for you to send to your client or for you to use for your own purposes. And the Excel spreadsheet actually contains an image file, a still image from the first frame of each cut. So what that helped with was that when Bright White had to commission the pose matching of the survivor, so that it wasn't too much of a jolt for somebody to see a survivor answer a question when they're in one particular position in the chair, and then start another question when they're in another situation, it meant that they could start pose matching, and they could use 3D software to generate a virtual model of the survivor to help with the dissolves between a question that could be asked at any point in time. It was hugely valuable for that, and some of the questions that were generated, because the project aims to sort of educate young people, a lot of the questions that were generated were children's questions, and they were hugely revealing about what you would ask somebody who survived the Holocaust. An adult might not think to ask them what the weather was like, but that in itself triggered off such an amazing response from many of the survivors, because it was a sensory memory, and that was fantastic to see what that actually brought about. So what we also did, what Bright White with the concept, they wanted to make sure that if somebody asked a question to the 3D projection that they didn't that we hadn't recorded a response for, that it didn't understand, that it needed to clarify, we recorded the survivor saying something like this, and this is just the left eye.
Would you like me to give the whole answer again?
Which means that if they're asked a question where they need to clarify it, that can be said. If somebody says, I didn't quite catch that, I didn't understand your response, that can be generated and used. That's Kitty Hart Moxon, who, an amazing story, she was actually survived Auschwitz for 2 years. So again, a lot of her memories have helped shape some of the media that has been then produced about Holocaust survivors down since then. A phenomenal story, and again added to the weight of how important this was, both from the filming, the storage, and then the post-production. And then some of the questions that a child might ask literally might be, how are you? So this is one of the responses.
Today I'm fine, but I'm actually sitting in a studio in the year 2016.
So a very simple, short response to a question like that, to make sure that people are grounded so that they know when it's been responded to, because what they want to make sure is that this is a project that is valid for 50, even more years down the future, and it's future-proof by doing everything in 4K. The next is a vague attempt through Keynote to try and show you what we were exporting. So you'll see a left and a right and a Blackmagic file. It comes down to, I'm not sure whether the GPU will play all files at once with actual audio sync, so some of them might not appear as if they're in sync, but trust me, they are. This is Kitty being asked if she thinks that the Holocaust could ever happen again.
I'm afraid the Holocaust can happen again if people don't listen and learn from what happened in the past. And this is why we're doing all this teaching, so that people will know what can happen and how to guard against it, how to find, to recognize the warning signs. That is the whole purpose of education, to try and stop it.
But again, one of the strengths of the raw workflow through FCPX is you can see here, and this was something I just had to spit out for us to use for the demonstration today, is that the left camera and the right camera that you can see on the screen, there's a slightly different colour cast, and that's from shooting through the mirror, and it gives all of the footage a slightly different tint. But because we knew that we could leave it until the last possible minute by working in RAW to then project that and see what the image looked like, it meant that all we had to do was go in and finally adjust the RMD file, and it would perfectly adjust all the way through, and we had a perfect file to spit out in ProRes that was colour matched and balanced. So in summary, we generated over 62 terabytes of R3D files, over 10 terabytes of 1080p ProRes files, and over 1.5 terabytes now of audio. We've exported over 34,000 individual clips from FCPX, each which have been perfectly frame synced and colour matched and graded. And we've had, so I need to give you some tech specs of what the system was, because this was kind of crucial. We invested in the new MacPro. So we've got a couple of the 6 cores and the 8 cores, but we made sure that they had the maximum GPU spec and then also the maximum RAM that you could purchase for the machine. that's what I think helped with the dual GPUs get us the performance we got. So we had real-time playback, and then what we actually got was from 4K RAW down to 4K ProRes, we got slightly faster than real-time export. So a 40-minute sequence exported just less than 40 minutes, which was amazingly quick given what we were doing. And part of that does come from the storage and how fast the storage was spinning, but all of that works to having a really good storage provider and making sure that's available to everybody who works on the project. So finally, I just want to say with thanks to the National Holocaust Centre for letting us actually use some of the footage, because a lot of it is still being processed at the moment. You can see the exhibit. It is actually installed and working at the National Holocaust Centre, but it does need to be, if you maybe get in touch with them before you visit to make sure that this can be viewed. Chris and Adam and Katie and everybody at Bright White and Lara for sort of agreeing again for us to sort of present, and Ronnie for getting in touch, because I think if Ronnie hadn't, we would still be exporting things one file at a time through Adobe Premiere or Resolve. And then all of the survivors who we interviewed, they were absolutely amazing and inspiring, fantastic project. If anyone's got any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. When is it viewable? So the first survivors data was installed in May. So Stephen Frank, who we recorded first, he was the first one through the pipeline. He's now available to see and experience virtually. So like I say, what that needs is perhaps some contact between whoever wants to visit and the National Holocaust Centre to see whether they're being used virtually at that time, because sometimes they take the virtual survivor off the projection run if the actual real survivor is still able to present, because they don't want to replace them too early. We're still actually processing some of the files to make sure that all 10 are available, but all 10 are due to be processed and delivered by sort of, I think it's winter this year, so late this year. I wasn't there, but I'm told it was really emotional when actually the first couple of survivors sat and interviewed themselves and asked a question to themselves that they hadn't thought of. And they were able to ask a question, and it does voice matching, and it can take any accent. So it doesn't just have to be perfect English. Somebody with French or German or Dutch or any sort of accent can ask a question. It will pick it up, and it does indeed respond. So it was fantastic. Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you.